So let me say that it's such a pleasure to moderate a panel that has the likes of Amitabh Kant, who is a remarkable bureaucrat. I've had the pleasure of working with him on several policy matters, and Amitabh is today the G20 Sherpa under the presidency of India for the G20 this year. Amitabh, of course, is someone who is really a great proponent of what India can do for the world. We also have Dr. Krishna Ella, who is one of the vaccine pioneers in India, and I'm sure he will have a lot to say. We have Sanat Chattopadhyay, another very well-known face in India, who I'm sure will have a lot to say in terms of what India can do in terms of being a part of rebuilding the global supply chain. And we also have, the participation of two very important people. My good friend Chris Bierbacher, who of course is someone with whom I worked very closely at RDMIC, which was a WHO, initiative during the pandemic to look at global supply chains, access, and planning. So I think that, and Chris did a remarkable job pulling it all together. He is a great leader. He is someone who has been sought after in terms of his leadership roles, and he's recently taken over at the helm of course, Biogen. And then finally, last but not least, we have Une-san, who of course knows not just India and Japan very well, but someone who's played a remarkable role in healthcare and understanding what the world needs to do in terms of global healthcare. So without further delay, I would like to now jump into this panel discussion, and maybe I'll start by alluding to what happened during the COVID pandemic, which really exposed the fragility and fragmentation of global supply chains. And as we all know, this resulted in denying vaccines to many parts of the waiting world. The lessons learned obviously call for rebuilding interconnected, resilient, and robust global supply chains that deliver both access and global reach. And I think this has to be done through sort of global distributed networks. I'm sure we all agree that technology will obviously play a key role to ensure that drugs, vaccines, medical devices, and medical services are both omnipresent and efficiently delivered to immunize its entire population of over 1 billion people. And we all understand the power of technology, and I think it will be very interesting to see how we use technology to answer these healthcare challenges of today and tomorrow. So let me start with you, Amitabh Kant.
And although partnerships and national efforts somewhat blunted the severity of supply chain disruptions during the pandemic, the effort to develop a global pandemic preparedness system, I think, has yet to gain full momentum. And, we need sustained political will and investment needed to ensure that the global healthcare supply chain can effectively respond to a future crisis. And this is important. And, the good news is that we've learned a lot in the past 2 decades, before the COVID with SARS and Ebola, but it'll take a lot more to create a more resilient and secure global healthcare supply chain. And to my mind, this will require a lot of political will and sustained financing over a long period of time, so that we look at funding should not dry up as memories fade and as priorities shift, because a crisis of this nature arises once in a lifetime. Secondly, there is a need for geographical diversification of manufacturing in different regions. Thirdly, there is a need for improved stockpiles and inventory management. There is also a need for platform for data sharing and much greater enhanced transparency, which was lacking. I think information sharing across public and private partners requires huge amount of effort. And then there is a need for fostering the free flow of goods. During the COVID period, we saw several governments' restriction on exports played a significant role in actually worsening product distribution shortages. And therefore, fostering free flow of goods is important. There is a need for coordinated early warning system for outbreaks. And ultimately, there is, to my mind, a very, very huge focus which we all need to lay on strengthening health systems and better primary care for the future. All this is very, very critical. In G20, we put this at the heart of our the challenge, and the G20 countries really feel, during our presidency, really feel that in focusing in all those areas, health emergencies, prevention, preparedness and response is the priority number one. The G20 members are sharing responsibility of providing health security to citizens, and that we need to encourage and promote innovation, global partnerships and knowledge sharing amongst the global scientific community. This is really the key to my mind, and that is what we've laid a massive focus on. The pandemic has demonstrated the need for global collaboration and partnership in vaccine development, climate research, and health data analytics to provide solutions. During the COVID, we could do it at fast pace, at massive pace. We could do this in India. One of the leading persons who was able to innovate as a part of our panel here, Mr. Krishnella. But we need to continuously see that this enhances this ability to deliver at a faster pace, constantly improves. So these are the key areas which the G20 is focusing on. Global collaboration as the key area for future pandemics is an absolute must, which the G20 is focusing on.
And at a macro level, at the micro level, there is a need to not only think about the finished product, but one of the things that we had to do was think about the end-to-end supply chain. So, for instance, stoppers and glass and syringes. And actually, that's where we needed a coordinating body like the RDMIC. We didn't know which vaccines were actually going to work, but we needed to put orders in to Corning for medical glass. We needed to find stoppers, and then we could help allocate that supply later. One of the things that came out, though, was we really need a lot more standardization. So if I think this on a more macro level, we don't have a single assay for antibodies. There are three. There are two assay T cells, and they give dramatically different results between them. If you use one of them consistently, it's fine, but it made it very difficult to compare vaccines. We need regulatory harmonization. We had a situation where the AstraZeneca vaccine was deemed to be safe by the European Medicines Agency, but then Denmark decided that it wasn't. And that caused an awful lot of concern around the safety and confidence in vaccines in general, because regulatory agencies were saying different things. So we can get supply, but we can undermine that if we don't have regulatory harmonization. Amitabh spoke about the export controls. My personal view is that it's always going to be politically difficult for a government to start exporting a finished product until the domestic population is vaccinated. But there are two things that I think we can do. One is we have to make sure we're not having export controls on the components of this, because that can actually hurt all countries together. And the second thing is, to the point of capacity, we probably need to put more vaccine capacity in countries with moderate-sized domestic populations so that they can vaccinate those populations quickly and then start exporting. So think Korea, think Australia, think Canada. They can get that through their domestic population and then release that capacity. Mapping of capacity is important. Remember, vaccine factories and even for antibodies and other things, they're not sitting around empty. And so one of the things that we found we had to do was cobble together supply chains, not just of components, but for instance, we needed sterile fill and finish capacity. And where could we find that? And that might be a different place than where we're producing the active ingredient. And having that mapped out in advance would actually speed up the process, because I think at some point we actually had a vaccine approved faster than we could actually get all the supply chains to get it up and running. So I think some of these things, can be coordinated. Some of them are going to be more politically difficult, but I think some of them could actually be managed by WHO and other agencies down below.
Because it brings the idea and the execution of it. And two combined. And we've done it with the rotavirus vaccine, CDC, Stanford, NIH. We've done the rotavirus. Typhoid conjugate we have done with the Gates Foundation and all the UK institutes and US institutes. All of them we've done, more than 20 billion. I mean, 2 billion. So this also brings to a point why public-private partnership is also important. So when we were talking earlier, one of the speech I heard the clinical trial, expansion of the scaling up the clinical trial in India. Truly, the public-private one way of scaling up this. And I think what is important is now the COVID. We were talking about the capacities and all that. Now the question is now what we are going to face now globally post-COVID: excess capacity, excess capacity available. Now, how do you sustain that? So I think we are seeing already in India, the people who started now gone into trouble. And that is happening all over. So I think, the question is the collaboration. I think the government of India has done, and even the US government has done, all the government have done. If you look at it globally, all the government actively involved in containing the pandemic with the industries, all of them, irrespective of all the government. So that is a phenomenal job the government has done. But what is important, the public partnership is a very critical. Look at, Moderna has done with the NIH collaboration. Okay, I mean, like everyone, the AstraZeneca is Oxford, so Covaxin with ICMR. So everyone, one way or other, is you look at the Chinese also with defense institutes there. So I think it is a public partnership is the one way to go about the containing of any pandemic in the future. 2 bullet points I want to make in the end. One of them is the all neglected disease are only in the Asia and Africa. And today, all neglected disease, what it turns into pandemic. So the capacity building is a much more crucial, and collaboration is much more crucial in Asia and Africa, because that is where it starts on the pandemic. So I think that's a very critical. I think people should look at it that in different directions.
Very old questions. As a matter of fact, as you may know, only several countries could create and launch innovative product. Only several countries. And on the other hand, nowadays, many startups and academia brought in innovative idea or technologies or pharmaceutical seeds. And so that it's really, once again, the time to establish substantial yet flexible bridging between established and startup companies or academia. Once again, while this is very old questions and always asked in Japan too, G20 and the Indian presidency after COVID-19 looks the best opportunity and the timing to set up the real good substantial action plans beyond the corporate basis. So Indian cabinet or government should take a good leadership and provide forward-looking statement after G20 meeting. I think this is always struggling, every part of the world, including Japan, but how substantially achieved? I think there are 3 important elements once again to overcome this: leadership and structure, and finally, financial support. So the people here can provide some good idea to Indian government to set up some basis how to do this. This is a little different from what you asked, but how to collaborate amongst established companies and startups. There is opportunity here G20. So I hope some good groups or delegations are organized and rotating to several countries upon a regular basis for next 2 or 3 years, and exchange the idea and pick up an idea and do some experiments together and continue, plus or minus, anyway, continue next 2 or 3 years. And once even a small part could be successful, then it's a good seeds of G20, Bio-pharma G20 consortium.
Is going to involve multifaceted aspects, because you're talking about 3,000 different components getting sourced from 300 different vendors and sources, where standardization is very difficult. It always is platform dependent, be it assay, be it components, be it the process of manufacture. So it's a very daunting task. So one of the minimum things that we have to do is really to understand that, be it single-use components, be it those scarce items which could really lead to a shortage when you have these kind of pandemics, what is a best way to have a much more well-regulated way of dividing up these suppliers so that there's an equitable distribution. Now, it's easier said than done, but that needs to be thought through in a much better way. But there's another topic, and Krishna and I often talk about it, is how to look at the next generation platforms for infectious and non-infectious diseases, which could create a very different kind of a supply chain and possibility of looking at many of these things differently. We all know that when it comes to vaccines, they are, of many different areas where you can talk, you're talking about inactivated, toxoids, live attenuated, VLPs, synthetic peptides, polysaccharides, glycoconjugates, viral vector, nucleic acids, all of those, and bacterial vectors, synthetic antigen. But the point is that we have reached a point right now where we need to understand, is there a better way to look at the future platforms? And I think the pandemic has helped us to look at this very differently than in the past. I think there's going to be a lot more focus on the getting away from the conventional vaccines, which are time-consuming to produce, which involve a greater risk of reversion to virulence, which need a lot more customized development against emerging and rapidly evolving pathogens. So my sense is that you will see a lot more bacterial vector vaccines, where live bacterial cells will be used as carriers, and they have already emerged as an integrating approach to produce novel vaccines with promising results. The genetic engineering techniques are going to enable the identification and deletion of critical bacterial virulence genes, and they will allow attenuation of dangerous bacteria, be it Yersinia pestis and all of those. I'll also like to guess that the viral vector vaccines are going to be used. And when we used the viral vector vaccine VSV to produce Ebola, it took me and my R&D head about 5 years by the time we came out with the Ebola vaccine. And that we considered as, in the journey of Merck, which has produced many vaccines in the last 100 years, the fastest ever Ebola. But now we see, during the time of the pandemic, a much speedier way of creating vaccines. So therefore, the question is, can we do synthetic DNA vaccines? And I know that there's been a lot of attempt in HIV, Ebola, HPV, Zika, and I know that there's not been enough amount of success as yet, but that may be because of not being able to generate robust B and T cell responses, but I'm quite sure they will come. The mRNA-based vaccines also are going to take us to a different place, and though, of course, the whole concept is more than 3 decades, kind of old, but the advancements that have taken place, both for conventional mRNA, self-amplifying mRNA, trans-amplifying mRNA, circular RNA, all these things are going to go there. So when you're talking about robustness of supply chain, we have to look at the meaning of the word robustness, not dealing to the different next generation platforms that can be used, and then try to understand what can be done to make them thermally stable so that they are able to be used and accessed in the low and middle income countries. It's very difficult for any regulatory authority to be able to take decision if really there's not enough data. So that's a given. So therefore, if your phase 3 is not adequately powered, then it just becomes difficult. And if it's a pediatric vaccine, it's even more difficult. So given all those limitations, I'm not necessarily advocating that there's a shortcut to success here, but I do believe that there is an opportunity for the regulatory authorities to look at post-approval expectations so that from a customer perspective, you can get to a different paradigm of speed to market. And yet with the post-approval commitments that all the manufacturers can make, you can definitely make sure that from a safety perspective, you're not necessarily, not doing the right thing as a regulator. The other thing, as Chris was rightly pointing out, is there a scope of standardization of components and test methods so that it's easier for the different countries to speed up? I know that molnupiravir was a very interesting case for Merck, where we were developing this product, and then we realized that at that point of time there was a very, very strong pandemic going on in India, and we gave 6 or 7 voluntary licenses to Indian manufacturers with the expectation that regardless of where the FDA process is, the Drugs Control of India will be able to take full advantage of all the technology that we are giving away, so that it's done faster, and faster meaning it should be able to be launched in India much before it gets launched in US. And we told whatever information is needed, we are ready to give to the DCGI. And of course, though in real life the launch did take place after the US FDA approval, but we were clear that we don't have to necessarily conduct the clinical trials in a manner where we will be slowing down what can happen in India. So all I'm trying to say is that you can look at all of these things in a manner where one can be very business pragmatic and yet be able to help the countries. But at the core, there are some certain things which are barriers, like the long-term stability at room temperature. If there's an over-dependence on ultra-low cold chain transport, if there are, aspects of high reactogenicity, if there is a very narrow safety window, of many of these platforms. So I'm not saying that all of these things are going to go away, but I'm hoping that with the development of potent and biodegradable lipids and new formulations, we'll be able to overcome a lot of these shortcomings in the future.
Infectious diseases are a whole of society issue. And the vaccine development paradigm actually has been transformed during COVID for emergencies. Actually, we should never forget how remarkable the vaccine development was. 326 days from genomic sequence to authorization of a COVID-19 vaccine is remarkable. For the next emerging threat, we need to make things even easier, regulatory mechanism even easier, so that we can do it in 75 to 100 days. But the important thing is that it's the equitable distribution which will require systematic change. Despite success of vaccine R&D, there has been persistent inequalities in access to the fruits of the vaccine development. And therefore, allocation is an important, very, very important question. And I think that's where the role of G20 comes in. And the G20 has to foster a very, very collaborative partnership so that it is able to provide health security to citizens. It, in moments of crisis, it should be able to encourage it, put a resource fund with the World Bank for future. But then, that resource will keep lying. It needs to be constantly kept alive. It needs to be constantly added on. And there has to be constant focus on health emergencies, prevention, preparedness, response. It has to be a constant process of ensuring that we need to encourage and promote innovation, global partnerships, and knowledge sharing amongst all the global scientific community on these issues. The other is that what India did during the COVID crisis, through the vaccine Maitri, the vaccine friendship, we despite our very severe phase 2, which impacted India in the second phase, we provided over 240 million COVID-19 vaccines to more than 100 countries around the world. We demonstrated that we need to help citizens across the globe to get access to vaccines during that period. We also innovated on the CoWIN platform to make vaccination process easy and transparent for healthcare providers and citizens. And that was a digital approach. And in future, I think digitization, ensuring that we are able to plan our vaccination strategy, all this is very critical. So I think post-pandemic, G20 has to play a very key role on the need for health systems to be resilient, that can recover quickly from shocks, ensure that there is a robust supply chain network, ensure that global value chains are a dominant feature of the market that provide inclusive growth, and ensure that there are adequate, huge push to a diversified global value chain in the days to come. These are all very critical, and G20 being a country of both emerging and developed countries, and G7, which account for 85% of the global production. And
what are things gone wrong global in G20 countries? Reviewing that would be helpful to us, all of us, to the country. The number two, whether G20 can have a pandemic fund can be allocated in G20. That's purely dedicated. We can't just prepare when the pandemic comes, preparing ourselves. No, we need to have some pandemic fund. Whereas Dr. Unesan said about startup, where this pandemic fund can fund some of the startups and build some of the technologies and keep ready for some of the input. And fourth aspect of it, how do we harmonize some regulatory system for pandemic vaccine? At least we can have not for childhood vaccines, not regular vaccination, but at least pandemic vaccines. What is a simple strategy we can build on harmonization? What type of protocol we build? We just do phase 1 and phase 2, just approve the vaccine, keep it ready. If any industry wants to do it, let them get phase 1, 2 approved and keep it ready. And the important for that, how do you QC reagents? Let us identify 20 pandemic problem. We identify the QC reagents and how this pandemic fund can help in building those QC quality control reagent, because that is the one which takes away all our strategy, both clinical trial and the manufacturing, both get affected because of the QC reagent. That has to be thought about it. And I mean, what the Sanat said about other supply chain, that is all important, that he has mentioned already. And I think, we need, and I think we should think about some pandemic fund, because the human is over. So what is next? So next 5-10 years, we may not get in human, but is it going to go to animals? Is it going to the human or the plants? There's another one which will not be touched yet. I mean, you look at the Irish famine in UK, Ireland. That is how the migration happened to US. People have moved to US because of one late blight disease in Europe. And same thing in animal. If the animal it comes, we are going to have food security issues. So I think we need to, beyond COVID, we should start looking at it different angle of this strategy in the G20 and also the collaboration partnership. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Krishna. So I think this has been a very, very comprehensive discussion around global supply chains. I think many key aspects of building or rebuilding new global supply chains have surfaced from standardization, harmonization, collaboration, information sharing, the use of digital technologies in connecting the various global supply chains. And of course, transparency and sharing is really at the base of all this. So I really want to thank this wonderful panel. I think every one of you has made some very, very pertinent points. I'm sure there's been a lot learned from this global crisis that we've all just gone through. Let's hope that pandemic preparedness is something that we are all going to be very confident of. And I know that every country has a role to play. I mean, that's what this pandemic has shown us. The global connectedness and, no one is safe till everyone is safe is really the kind of mantra we've all followed. And I think this has also opened up a huge recognition of partnerships, collaborations, public-private partnerships like Krishna alluded to. But more than anything else, I think this is a call for action. And this is a time when various forums like G20 can play a very, very key role in shaping global healthcare for the future.